This is part 4 of Lecture 7 on the nervous system. This information can be found in Chapter 11 on pages 389 to 425 of your textbook. Graded potentials are short-lived, localized changes in membrane potential. The stronger the stimulus, the more voltage will change, and the farther the current will flow. This is triggered by stimulus that open gated ion channels and will result in depolarization or hyperpolarization. They are named according to location and function. Receptor potential or generator potential are graded potentials and receptors of sensory neurons. Postsynaptic potential are neuron-graded potentials. Once a gated ion channel opens, depolarization spreads from one area of the membrane to the next. The current will flow, but will dissipate quickly and decay. Graded potentials are signals only used over short distances. Action potentials are the principal way that neurons send signals in terms of long-distance neural communication. They are only in muscle cells and axons of neurons. An action potential will not decay over distance as a graded potential will. There are 4 main steps. First, the resting state, or in this case, at the top of this diagram here. All of the gated sodium and potassium channels are closed. Only leakage channels for sodium and potassium are open. Each sodium channel has 2 voltage-sensitive gates, an activation gate, which is closed at rest and open with depolarization, allowing sodium to enter into the cell, and an inactivation gate, which is open at rest and block the channel once it is open to prevent more sodium from entering the cell. Each potassium channel has 1 voltage-sensitive gate, which is closed at rest and opens slowly with depolarization. Number 2, depolarization on the right-hand side. Depolarizing local currents open the voltage-gated sodium channels, and sodium rushes into the cell. Sodium activation and inactivation gates are both open, and the sodium influx causes more depolarization, which opens more sodium channels. As a result, the intracellular fluid becomes less negative. At a threshold point, which is typically around -55 to -50 millivolts, a positive feedback will cause opening of all sodium channels. It results in a large action potential spike, and the membrane polarity jumps to +30 millivolts. 3. Repolarization at the bottom. Sodium channels are inactivated and the potassium channel is open. Sodium channel inactivation gates will close, and the membrane permeability to sodium declines to resting state, and the action potential spike stops rising. Voltage-gated potassium channel is open. Potassium exits the cell down its electrical chemical gradient. Repolarization is basically when the membrane returns to resting membrane potential. Hyperpolarization, in the middle. Some potassium channels remain open, and some sodium channels reset. Some potassium channels will remain open, allowing an excessive potassium efflux. The inside of the membrane becomes more negative than in resting state. This causes hyperpolarization of the membrane, or a slight dip below resting voltage. Sodium channels also begin to reset. Repolarization resets electrical conditions, not ionic conditions. After repolarization, the sodium-potassium pumps, and there are thousands of them in an axon, restore ionic balance. Not all depolarization events will produce an action potential. For an axon to fire, depolarization must reach threshold voltage, and there is an all or none principle. An action potential either happens or it does not happen at all. Propagation allows an action potential to be transmitted from the origin down the entire axon length towards the terminals. Since sodium channels closer to the action potential origin are still inactivated, no new action potential is generated there. The action potential occurs only in a forward direction. All action potentials are alike. and are independent of stimulus intensity. The central nervous system tells the difference between a weak stimulus and a strong one by the frequency of impulses. Frequency is basically the number of impulses received per second. A higher frequency will result in a higher stimulus. The refractory period is the time in which neurons cannot trigger another action potential. Voltage-gated sodium channels are open, so the neuron cannot respond to another stimulus. And there are two types of refractory periods, absolute and relative. In an absolute refractory period, the time from the opening of the sodium channels until resetting of the channels ensures that each action potential is an all or none event. It enforces one-way transmission of nerve impulses. For a relative refractory period, this follows an absolute refractory period. Most sodium channels have returned to the resting state. Some potassium channels are still open. Repolarization is occurring. The threshold for action potential is elevated, and only an exceptionally strong stimulus could stimulate an action potential. In terms of conduction velocity, there are two factors which will affect it: the axon diameter and the degree of myelinization. Axon diameter. Larger diameter fibers have less resistance to local current flow, and so will have faster impulse conduction. Degree of myelinization. Two types of conduction are depending on the presence or absence of myelin. Continuous conduction is a slow conduction that occurs in non-myelinated axons. Saltatory conduction occurs only in myelinated axons and is about 30 times faster. The myelin sheaths insulate and prevent leakage of the charge, and the electrical signal appears to jump rapidly from gap to gap. And this is the conclusion of this part of Lecture 7 on the nervous system.